good to still see you in the room. I know it's been a long day, but it's been an awesome one. I know you just listened to Pierre talk about some of the threats that he's been seeing, and so it's probably not going to be a surprise for you to hear that data breaches still happen. It's an unfortunate thing, but they still do happen. Now, today we've got some panelists with us who are going to share their experiences as far as the process of dealing with a data breach. We've got the acquirer side, we've got the PFI side, but they're going to patiently sit there for a second while I give you guys some dirt about the things that we have found. Now, if you're not aware, the council runs the PCI Forensics Investigators Program, or the PFI program. We don't get the actual reports. We are not interested in the details of that, so don't ask me about specific breaches. I don't know, and I wouldn't tell you anyway. But what we do get is an appendix that the assessors provide with anonymized data, and what that provides to us, it gives us kind of a glimpse of, who are these people getting breached? Are they people that are, are they entities that have been, doing rocks before? Have they done an SAQ? Have they done nothing? What kind of work are they doing, et cetera? So it just gives us a very high-level idea of what's going on out there. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that data so you can kind of get a glimpse of what we see, and then we're going to have a panel discussion about, what these guys do on the ground, figuring out what's happened. So starting things off, we've got the breaches reported by region. And so what I want to say about this is that Asia-Pac, you can see, is highly represented here. But what I would keep in mind there is that they're kind of the tail end of being an emerging market. They've been working on getting PCI DSS compliant. And so, naturally, they are going to have more breaches. The US has always had a little bit more than Europe because we were a little bit slower on the chip and pin, and so you can see that evolution. But the total number of reported breaches is generally coming down because we've strengthened, our posture with a lot of different technologies. We've got, just the existence of PCI DSS and the implementation. You've got EMV, P2PE, a lot of things that are making things safer. We're not seeing as many breaches with large merchants. So, the big names you might have heard of in the past, they're the ones that are now on the stage, telling you about how they're doing amazing work and they're setting an example to everybody. So who's really getting breached at this point? You've got, your third-party service providers, you've got your smaller merchants. And so as we go through this data, just kind of keep that in mind to give the data some context. Should not be much of a surprise. Card not present is the majority of the breaches that we see. It's not any kind of change. And that's a combination of, your mail order, telephone order, your kiosks, e-com. There's a lot of different paths that are included in that. So as part of the appendix, there's this section that the assessor fills out, and they ask the question, was the PCI DSS requirement in place? We're trying to figure out, what went wrong and where. And if you look at this graph, the little purple part, it says partial yes. And the reason it says partial yes is because the PFI, while they may be a QSA, they're not going there to do a full QSA assessment. They're there to do their PFI assessment. And so that partial yes is going to be them saying, it looks like it's on the up and up. No reason to say no. You'll get the no if anything stands out. And if you think about in the context of, the majority of these maybe being smaller merchants that haven't done rocks before, it kind of makes sense that you see so many no's there. No big surprises, the requirements that are highly featured here. But yeah, that's, you'll see 6, 10, and 11 are in particular, but most of these are high because, again, these people may never have done a rock. They may not have network diagrams. It's very early in their PCI DSS journey. They're kind of jumping in the deep end there. If we compare the requirements being in place year to year, you see some consistency. There's probably still too much not in place for us to be very satisfied with this. But again, these are more those small merchants that haven't been involved in PCI DSS. The cause of breach, we've got 2 shades of purple. That's fun. at 5, 6, 7, you can see that little bit of purple there that's saying, this was the cause of breach. And then most of these are that dark purple that's like, and that's just really because the threshold for saying, yes, this was the cause of breach, it's pretty high. And so where things usually land is on this next slide, where we say contribute to breach. Maybe we don't conclusively know what caused the breach, but because of these different things that were not in place, all of these things collectively certainly could contribute to the breach. There aren't really any surprises here. 6, 8, 11, the scans, the patching, stuff like that, those continue to be issues. Hopefully we'll see some changes as, some of the requirements for like SAQA change with 4.0. But these are basically the results that we typically see. It's just good to kind of see this data. I would remind you that our PFIs, they're coming in at the end of this, and so there's not much they can do about the number. They're kind of just letting people know what's going on. But it's useful information nonetheless. Okay, so this is the fun part. This is when we talk to our experts. We've got our acquirer and our PFI represented. We've got Helen Huyton, compliance officer at Adyen. She's representing our acquire side. And then we've got Benn Morris. He's the managing director for 3B data security. And, these are the stars of the PFI process, really. There's a lot of entities that are involved in this. You've got the card brands as well. But the acquire and the PFI, those are the big dogs. So I'm going to start my questions with you, Helen. In your role at Adyen, can you describe for us how you're typically made aware of a potential breach? And then generally, how do you respond when one of your merchants is suspected of a breach?
Yeah, of course. So we receive notifications from various different sources, and then depending on the source, we receive different kinds of information. So firstly, we could hear it directly from our merchant, who might have observed unusual activity themselves, or they could have been informed by their hosting provider. We may also receive a notification from the schemes, for instance. They're also always monitoring for unusual activity, or it could have been reported by another acquirer, for instance. We may also be made aware of a potential breach from issuers. So issuers are, of course, always monitoring for fraudulent activity. Furthermore, we are also always monitoring the news for adverse media, which probably we see more and more these days. And lastly, we also always have our internal teams, which are monitoring for any kind of suspicious activity on checkout pages. So that's, the main ways in which we're made aware of a breach. And it doesn't matter what kind of notification it is. The most important thing to do is to take action immediately, because with a breach, there's always very limited time and timelines that we have to stick to. And when we're made aware of such a breach, what we do is we have an initial call with the merchant. We talk them through the process, what's going to happen. We try and gain more insights into the incident. And we also ask them to complete an incident report. And from this incident report, we ask basic questions about what happened or what could have potentially happened, and evaluate whether or not cardholder data is at risk, which is very important. And we, of course, report this then to the schemes. And lastly, what's also really important when we first hear about such notification is the containment steps, which is something that the PFI is also heavily involved in. So we really inform merchants to preserve all of the evidence, to contain, but to also isolate any systems or servers. This is really important. And to document any changes that are made so that when PFIs come in, that they have all the evidence that they need in order to perform a proper investigation.
Excellent. And that's going to bring us to you, Benn. You're the boots on the ground, I guess. You're coming in to look at all this evidence and figure out what the heck happened. Same question to you.
Yeah, so there's a number of ways we get involved. Traditionally, or most commonly, once the acquirer, like Helen's explained, has spoken to the merchant, they'll give us a call. There's a few other ways. Sometimes we work it out ourselves. Sometimes a third party will contact us. We also have proactive clients that sign up to retainer services. So if they did have an issue, we've already sort of got telemetry or understanding of their environment. But however we get involved, the first main steps, if we're not already aware of the client, is that we will start to understand the scope. So we'll start asking questions. Most of the time, we'll get negative answers because the merchant won't have a network diagram or understand all the people that are involved and things like that. And they will go away and try and find out the answers. We then need to obviously sort out contracts and legals and things like that. So you can see how the process can be delayed if these threads aren't sort of sorted in advance. And as Helen sort of quite rightly said, the biggest thing that we really need to ensure is that the crime scene isn't walked on. And often a merchant will overreact and try and contain things. That's often a hindrance to us for the to wait an extra half an hour and call us and get us involved. We can do it in the right way. So that's the sort of recommendation that I would have, if nothing else.
Perfect. So Helen, when a breached merchant has third-party service providers, and I think merchants have a lot of those, so that's not really an if, but kind of a how many. It could be web hosting, payment processors, whatever. How might that complicate your job as an acquirer?
Yeah, we definitely find this to be a challenge because the merchant sometimes likes to put the responsibility on the third-party service provider, and the third-party service provider simply doesn't want to take responsibility. So this confusion definitely can cause delays in the investigation, and sometimes when third-party service providers are not willing to provide certain information, it can even lead to inconclusive investigations. So yeah, this is really a challenge, and what we particularly notice is that requirement 12 from PCI has not properly been met, and that third-party service providers and merchants may have made agreements beforehand, but they may not detail what to do in the case of an escalation, which is something that's really needed. So we always advise merchants to make good agreements with their third-party service providers in the good and the bad times, so that they can really depend on them.
Great. So Ben, I hear of some of the troubles the PFIs have with third-party service providers because some of what Helen talks about, and in particular, maybe those third parties aren't necessarily tied into the schemes. They aren't necessarily, obligated to participate in the same way. What is your experience as a PFI with these third parties?
Yeah, so it's generally one of two ways. Some third parties sort of close the doors, get instantly defensive, mention about the fact that they're not contracted, they don't need to be compliant and things like that. And a lot of the work we do on those ones is sort of nothing technical. It's all human. It's trying to explain and justify why it might be useful to a third party. And the main real reasons is if it is a third party breach, then there's potentially every one of their clients is at risk. So we might get involved with the first client, and if they then take action at that point, they might save a lot of risk for all their other clients in the ecosystem. On the flip side, there's third parties that instantly recognise their responsibility and will open their doors to help and see it as a valued thing to ensure that they don't generate more harm or risk to the ecosystem for all the other merchants and people down the supply chain, really.
Okay. Helen, as far as the merchants and service providers are concerned, what could they do to help prevent these, breaches in the first place? And maybe even what could they do to proactively be prepared in the case of a breach?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, and Ben probably knows more about this, but from all of the breaches that we've seen as an acquirer, the main reason why the merchant is breached is because they weren't compliant with PCI. So having a PCI program in place, but also making sure that it's a continuous program and not just a one-time in the year exercise where you check the tick boxes is really, really important. What we also see from the acquirer perspective is that merchants tend to incorrectly scope their environment if they're using an encrypted solution or if they're using a third party. They think, oh, I'm outsourcing everything, so I have no responsibility, which is when we swoop in and try to explain to them that's not exactly right. And we really promote our general rule of thumb is if you accept credit card payments online or in stores or via your mobile app, then you probably have to be PCI compliant in some way or another. And then a lot of the conference has been about all, of course, the new different ways in which malicious actors are evolving their threats and the new vulnerabilities in the industry. This is also something that we see is very important. And in order to mitigate these new vulnerabilities and in order to address these risks, we're really encouraging merchants to transition to PCI DSS version 4 as soon as possible, because that's what the standard is there for, to really address these new vulnerabilities. And that's one way in which merchants and service providers can really try and stay away from breaches. And lastly, something that I think we all really try to do is, at Adyen as an acquirer, but also amongst our merchants, is to really promote more of a security-conscious culture and more security awareness as well. I think it's been addressed over the past few days, but even if you don't have security in your title, you are still really crucial for protecting the company. So those are the main things that we really would address.
Yeah, I think this morning the takeaway that I got from Jenny's presentation was
Definitely.
we're all security, whether it's in our title or not. Same question to you, Ben. What do you think that merchants and service providers can do to prevent the breaches and be ready in the unfortunate case one actually happens?
Yeah, I think the simplest word to sort of answer that question is to sort of be responsible, take responsibility. As Helen sort of alluded to, just because you outsource, and this is also a point that my colleague Paul said an hour or so ago, just because you outsource doesn't mean you've outsourced all your responsibility. Mostly every breached merchant I speak to says, oh no, but we outsourced that, or we don't need to be compliant, I've outsourced that. Well, you've believed the salesperson there, unfortunately. You haven't actually looked at what you're responsible for. And similarly, from a service provider perspective, they need to also take responsibility, because they're a bigger party that can have a bigger negative effect if they don't do what they need to do. So I think the main sort of takeaways is, take a slightly cynical view, trust but verify. You do need to validate that the people you're outsourcing to are doing what they should do. And there are things that you as a merchant will have to do, irrespective to how much you outsource. If nothing else, you still need to validate the people you're outsourcing to. And from a service provider's perspective, it's being proactive, and it's making sure that the controls and the systems you put in place and how you deal with those merchants sort of achieves the aim of PCI, even if they don't believe they need to be compliant, which they generally do, because they just don't have somebody sort of forcing that on them. So trying to be proactive, irrespective of not having an acquirer or a brand phoning you up every month saying, get compliant. So I think that's the biggest thing, is to be proactive, take responsibility.
Okay. Thank you both for your contributions to this industry, for helping us keep it safer, for participating in this panel. Guys, these folks are going to be here for the next couple of days, so catch them at the vendor showcase tonight, ask questions. I'll be there too, but I'm not as informative as them, so we can just make jokes. But thank you all very much, and appreciate you attending the session.